Hi, hi. We are at the end of our novel. We have three more chapters and we will listen to them all today. So today we will listen to 21, 22, and 23. And we are done with an amazing novel on Hidden Figures. So let's get started with chapter 21, Out of the Past, the Future. Sending a man to space was a tall order, but it was the part about returning him safely to Earth that kept Catherine, Johnson, and the rest of the Langley employees awake at night. There were countless ways that things could go wrong, and they needed to be ready for each one. The rocket had to operate flawlessly. The Atlas rocket was going to be used to take the Mercury capsule into orbit, but it was temperamental. Two of its five previous launches had ended in failure. One rocket had surged into the sky, then exploded midair. There seemed to be an infinite number of things that could go wrong with the spacecraft. The space capsule itself was a sophisticated tin can, but one that required elaborate engineering. The vehicle's oxygen and pressurization systems were all that stood between the life crushing vacuum of space and the person riding inside. If the capsule wasn't strong enough to withstand the intense forces of this launch, it would explode. Every wire, every switch, every gauge, every component had to be tested and retested to make sure that it worked flawlessly. Success depended on the engineer's mastery of the laws of physics and mathematics. The spacecraft demanded extreme precision and accuracy. Even a simple error would have catastrophic, meaning deadly, consequences. There seemed to be an infinite number of ways things could go wrong, and only one way to get it right. So remember, Hive, as you are solving calculations, doing your math, think about this. If you were sending a person to space, would you do it once or would you go back and check your work? America's astronaut. Nobody understood the risks of spaceflight better than astronaut John Glenn. The former U.S. Marine Corps test pilot had been chosen to, or as the astronaut for America's first orbital flight. He pushed his body to the physical limit to prepare for the mission. And he worked tirelessly on the simulators and trainers, preparing for every failure scenario the engineers could imagine. He knew that his life depended on the readiness. If your life depended on the math that you were doing, or the calculations that you were making, or the reading that you were doing, what attention would you pay to detail? Let's get back. As a pilot, Glenn knew that the only way to remove all risk was to cancel the mission. He understood that he was likely to encounter some unforeseen problems, so he did his best to be ready for them. The preparations took longer than expected, and Project Mercury's launch was pushed back from late 1960 to July 1961, and then to 1962. The Russians didn't slow down. In August of 1961, they completed a 17-orbit flight, nearly a full day in space. The Soviet successes put even more pressure on NASA to get the mission off the ground. In addition to the technical challenges, the launch team had to deal with the weather. Overcast skies at Cape Canaveral, Florida delayed takeoff on two or more dates. Finally, the date was set, February 20th, 1962. John Glenn handled the delays with patience and grace. He stayed in top condition and remained focused. Before taking off, he asked the engineers to complete one more check. He asked them to double check the math that had been done by the electronic computers. Many of the astronauts didn't fully trust the electronic number cruncher machines. As former test pilots, they staked their reputations and their lives on maintaining constant and direct control over their planes. A tiny error in judgment or a delay could mean disaster. The Mercury mission linked the spacecraft with the electronic computers on the ground. The astronauts worried. What if the computers lost power or seized up during the flight? When the Space Task Group bought more powerful computers, the trajectory equations were programmed into the machines so that they could automatically guide and control the rock and send information about the capsule's position back to mission control. If the rocket misfired and sent the capsule into an incorrect orbit, the computer would alert the flight controllers who had the power to abort the mission. The capsule would detach from the rocket and land safely in the sea, where the astronaut could be reached or rescued. Once successfully launched, the capsule would push through the atmosphere and settle into orbit. It would separate from rocket and establish new communication connections with the ground stations. The spacecraft would send data back to the tracking stations, which would capture the signals with their 64-foot deceiving dishes. The Goddard Space Center in Maryland would also send Mission Control in Texas data about the spaceship's position. Hovering over the giant map of the world at Mission Control was a little cutout of Mercury capsule, suspended on a wire. As data came into the Mission Control, the image of the capsule would move across the map. While it was an unsophisticated map by today's standards, at that time, it helped the engineers follow the flight path. The capsule signal would bounce from one tracking station to another as it moved. The data would allow the controllers to ask, where was the capsule compared to where they had calculated it to be at a given time? Was it too high, too low, too slow, or too fast? They would constantly refine their data and make adjustments. This information would be used to determine exactly when the capsule's rockets should fire to bring the spacecraft back to Earth. For the mission to succeed, the hardware, the software, and the human beings had to function properly. A breakdown in any component would be tragic, and it would all unfold on live television. The human computers crunching numbers were something the astronauts understood and trusted. The women mathematicians dominated their mechanical calculators the way the test pilots dominated the planes. Spaceship flying computers might be the future, but John Glenn didn't have to trust them. He did trust the human computer, Katherine Johnson. Get the girl to check the numbers, Glenn said. If Katherine Johnson said the numbers were good, he was ready to go. Countdown. The space age and the television age were coming into their own at the same time. NASA understood that they were making history and that the events taking place should be broadcast to the world and recorded for history. The agency sent a film crew to each of the tracking stations, recording the communications teams, and they completed their pre-flight checkouts. The footage showed the second-by-second drama in Mission Control as white men in white shirts and black ties faced the crowds and the long desks with communications consoles. Headphones on, serious expressions on their faces. The men stared up at an enormous electronic map of the world on the wall in front of them. Because of her close working relationship with the pioneers of the Space Task Group, it was Katherine Johnson who found herself in a position to make the most immediate contribution to the Mercury mission. When the phone call came in Katherine Johnson's office at Langley, she was sitting at her desk. She overheard the call with the engineer who picked up. She knew she was the girl because being discussed in the phone conversation, astronaut John Glenn didn't know her name, but she was the one he was talking about when he wanted someone to double check the numbers. Catherine knew the numbers he meant, the ones that describe the trajectories of an orbital mission around Earth, just like her first research report, the one she had worked on with the engineer Ted Skopinski. In the final section of the report, Catherine had calculated by her hand 2 different sample orbits, plugging numbers into the equations into the report. Then she compared her results to the results from the IBM electronic computer, which had been programmed to calculate the same equations. At the time, it turned out that there was very good agreement between IBM's output and Catherine's calculations. Catherine and the machine got the same numbers. This work, double-checking the electronic computer, was a dress rehearsal for the work that was now required. Checking the numbers not for a sample orbit, but for a real mission, with an astronaut on board. Confidence. Though Katherine Johnson didn't usually panic in stressful situations, she was very nervous about the task in front of her. But she was confident in her math skills, so she organized herself at her desk. Thick stacks of data sheets and trajectory equations surrounded her workspace. Instead of generating numbers and sending them to be checked by the computer, Catherine would work in the reverse. She took the data from the computer and ran it through her own calculations. She wanted to see very good agreement between her numbers and those generated by the computer. Catherine worked through every minute of a 3-orbit mission. It took a day and a half of watching the numbers pile up until she had completed the task. When she delivered the data sheets to the Project Mercury engineer, she had no doubt that her numbers were correct. February 20th. 1962. Dawn bright and clear, and 135 million people turned in to watch the launch unfold on live television. Katherine Johnson sat in her office, breathlessly watching the news coverage. At 9:47 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, the Atlas rocket boosted Friendship 7 into orbit. Ground control cleared John Glenn for 7 orbits around Earth. During the first orbit, the capsule's atomic control system began to act up, causing the capsule to pull back and forth like a badly aligned car. Glenn smoothed it out by switching the system to manual and acting as if he were flying a plane. At the end of the second orbit, a warning light indicated that the heat shield was loose. A heat shield is the outer covering on the spacecraft that protects it from extreme heat when the craft re-enters Earth's atmosphere. Without that firewall, there was nothing standing between Glenn and the 3,000-degree temperature, almost as hot as the surface of the sun, that would build up around the capsule as it passed back into Earth's atmosphere. Mission Control had a solution. At the end of the third orbit, after the retro rockets fired, Glenn was to keep the rocket pack attached to the spacecraft instead of getting rid of it, as was standard procedure. The NASA engineers hoped that the rocket would keep the loose heat shield in place. At 4 hours and 33 minutes into the flight, the rockets fired. John Glenn adjusted the capsule to the correct position and waited. The spaceship slowed down and pulled out of its orbit, heading down. At that point, the most dangerous part of the re-entry, the signals flickered, then went silent. There was no signal from Friendship 7. The engineers tried to figure out what had gone wrong, but there was nothing Mission Control could do. Silence. 1 minute passed, then 2, then 3. Everyone feared the worst, that the heat shield had failed and the spacecraft had been burned. The team struggled to reconnect with the spacecraft. 10 minutes passed. 11, 12, 13. 14 minutes after the signal silenced, John Glenn's voice returned. He was alive. The spaceship continued its descent, with the computer predicting a perfect landing. When Friendship 7 splashed down, it was off target by just 40 miles, and that minor error was only because the estimated weight of the capsule during re-entry included the added weight of the rocket that had to remain in place. The computers, both electronic and human, had worked flawlessly. 21 minutes after landing, astronaut John Glenn was safely out of the water. John Glenn was a hero. He had an audience with the president, a ticker tape parade in New York, and from Maine to Moscow, large newspaper headlines cheering him. The African American press cheered him. All of us are happy to call him our ace of space, wrote an African American columnist in the Pittsburgh Courier. Nowhere was the hero's welcome as warm as in Hampton Roads, Virginia. 30,000 local residents turned out in mid-March to celebrate the man they considered their hometown hero. Glenn rode in the lead vehicle of a 50-car parade that included the Mercury astronauts and their families. The 22-mile route went through Hampton and Newport News. The parade ended at a stadium where Glenn stood behind a podium with a sign reading Spacetown, USA. The crowd of Hampton changed its official seal to depict a crab holding a Mercury capsule in its claw. It adopted the motto E Praeteritus Futura, out of the past, the future. John Glenn wasn't the only one being cheered. Word of Katherine Johnson's role in the mission made the rounds in the African American community. On March 10, 1962, a photograph of Katherine Johnson was featured on the front page of the Pittsburgh Courier. The caption read, "Her name, in case you haven't already guessed it, is Katherine Johnson, mother, wife, career woman." The article recounted Katherine's contributions to the work that sent Glenn's rocket through space. Johnson attended the Hampton Parade, allowing herself just a moment of pride at having been part of such an accomplishment. She didn't stay too long. She wanted to recognize the hard work and success of the team. Just like us, it doesn't take one person. It's a team to get all of our efforts done. So always remember that. She wanted to recognize the hard work and success of the team, but there was nothing more exhilarating for her than getting back to work on the next assignment. America is for everybody. Chapter 22. Said the U.S. Department of Labor brochure issued on April of 1963. The cover showed a young African-American boy, barefoot and dressed in a shirt and worn jeans, sitting on a dusty railroad track. In the text, President John F. Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson described the social and economic progress that African Americans had made since the end of slavery, 100 years before. One of the inspirational photographs inside the pamphlet showed Katherine Johnson working at her desk at Langley, already hard at work on the calculations that would one day help send an astronaut to the moon. The same year that brochure was published, A. Philip Randolph, the civil rights leader who had pushed President Roosevelt to open war jobs to African Americans during World War II, planned the March on Washington for jobs and freedom, inviting political and religious leaders and even well-known singers of many backgrounds to participate. On August 28, 1963, an estimated 300,000 people marched through the nation's capital, gathering on the National Mall to hear a series of speeches. The defining moment of the event came when 34-year-old Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. addressed the crowd. Shortly after he began speaking, Mahalia Jackson, one of the singers who had been invited to perform at the event, urged Dr. King to share his deepest feelings into the crowd. "Tell them about the dream, Martin," she said to him, urging him to speak to the crowd from his heart. King knew she was right. He set aside his prepared remarks and put both hands on the lectern. He then gave his country and the world 17 of the most memorable minutes in history. Dr. King's "I Have a Dream" speech reminded all the citizens of the nation that the African American dream and the American dream were one and the same. In many ways, Dorothy Vaughan was living the American dream. The director of the Langley Research Center sent Dorothy a letter acknowledging her 20 years of service to the federal government. He presented her with a gold and ruby lapel pin during the center's annual award ceremony. By the standards of their families and many associates, Dorothy and the other African American employees at NASA had secured professional jobs and the respect of their colleagues. They were part of the visions that Martin Luther King Jr. and President Kennedy and Johnson had for a more tolerant and just America. But there was still progress to be made. Even at Langley, of all the black employees working in research at Langley in the early 1960s, there were only 5 categorized as engineers and 16 with the title mathematician, including Dorothy. Langley's director wrote to NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C., lamenting that very few Negroes were applying for open science and engineering positions at the laboratory. There is no doubt that one of the reasons they do not apply is that they do not believe that the living conditions in the area would be favorable to them because the Langley Research Center, which is completely integrated, is situated in a community where social segregation based on color is still practiced to a certain extent, he wrote. Langley redoubled its recruiting efforts. In the mid-1960s, with dreams of working at NASA, greater numbers of African American college students found their way to the research center. When she wasn't at work, Katherine Johnson spent a great deal of her free time at community service activities and at church. After church one Sunday in 1967, Katherine saw a new face in the crowd. She went over and introduced herself to the young woman, who was there with her husband and 2 daughters. "I'm Katherine Johnson," she said. "Yes, I know," said Katherine Mann Darden. "You're Joylette's mother." Katherine's daughter, Joylette, had met Christine in college at Hampton Institute. Katherine and Christine had met once before at a sorority function, though they hadn't seen one another in years. Since graduating from Hampton Institute, Christina started working as a math teacher and had gotten married. Earlier that spring, she had completed her master's degree program at Virginia State University, a black college, and she had visited the school placement office during her final semester of study. "We wish you'd been here yesterday," said the placement officer. "NASA was here interviewing." The woman handed Christine an application for federal employment. Christine applied, and NASA offered her a position as a data analyst. Once in Hampton Roads, she saw Katherine Johnson and other former West computers on a regular basis, both at work and in the community. Christine had gone to school with Katherine's daughters, and she already felt a connection to her. Christine was part of the next generation of women at NASA. Those who would rely on the pioneers like Katherine and Dorothy and Mary for inspiration and guidance. Katherine Johnson invited Christine to join the choir at church. The 2 women got to know one another outside of the office, but they never worked together. Because Katherine was so modest, it would be years before Christine knew the full scope of her work. When someone acknowledged her achievements, Katherine said, "Well, I'm just doing my job." For Katherine, doing her job meant quietly sharing the joy when missions went well as grieving with the others when missions failed. Like the others at NASA, Catherine was devastated in January of 1967 when an electrical fire on board of the Apollo 1 command module took the lives of 3 astronauts, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, and Gus Grissom. The tragic end of Apollo 1 shook NASA to its core. The astronauts had been on the ground inside the module on the launch pad at Cape Canaveral when an electrical spark caused a fire that flashed through the inside of the craft, killing all 3 men inside. The engineers redesigned the spacecraft carefully, discovering then fixing the flaws that had caused the fire. They honored the dead by learning from the mistakes of the past and carrying on with future missions. Each experience offered important information that could be applied to the future flights. In the 1960s, the Apollo program built on its successes, steadily aiming toward a landmark achievement of the space program, a manned mission to the moon. The 238,900-mile mission to the moon would take 6 days. 3 days to get there and 3 days to come back. The ambitious plan included 21 hours exploring the surface of the moon for 2 astronauts in the lunar lander, a separate vehicle that would drive across the moon while the surface module circled above. The plan sounded simple, but Katherine Johnson knew better than anyone that if any aspect of the Apollo 2 mission to the moon went wrong, the astronauts could be stranded in space, never again to see their earthly home. Years later, Katherine would say that working on the math that coordinated the orbiting Apollo Command and Service Module, CSM, one part of the spaceship that would remain parked in orbit around the moon with the ship's lunar lander, the rowboat of a module that would take the astronauts from the CSM down to the moon's surface, was the highlight of her career at NASA. The leadership of the Space Task Group set a risk standard of 3 nines for the space missions. In other words, it required that every aspect of the program, every part, every plan, every person succeed 999 times out of 1,000. The astronauts were prepared to give their lives to the mission, but they didn't want to die because of a math error. Katherine Johnson worked long hours to make astronauts stayed safe. She arrived at the office early, went home in the late afternoon to check on her girls, and sometimes came back to work in the evening, maintaining a schedule of 14 or 16-hour days. She and the engineers she worked with asked each other what-if questions. What if the computers went out? What if there was an electrical failure on board of the spacecraft? What if something went wrong? They had to think ahead, anticipating and solving every problem they could think of before it happened. So if you think like the astronauts and Katherine did, is there anything that you think of that when your teacher is asking you to learn your multiplication facts, to learn a fact that's important for you, how would it be if you put in just an extra amount of time every time? It adds up. And just like the astronauts at NASA and the engineers at NASA, they had to make sure that 999 times out of 1,000 that they were accurate. Imagine if we put that much effort into the things we do every day. Now we are at the concluding paragraph of Hidden Figures. I am so excited. Buckle your seats. The ending is just as sweet as the beginning. Chapter 23. One small step. A human being on the moon. It was hard for most people to believe that something that humankind had dreamed up for thousands of years was finally coming true. It also amazed Americans to learn that what an expensive trip it was. Together, the Apollo missions cost a mind-boggling $24 billion, or about $156 billion in today's dollars. Not everyone believed that the exploration of space was worth the astronomical price tag. A few days before the Apollo 2 launch, 200 protesters marched outside Cape Canaveral as part of the Poor People's Campaign, a movement designed to bring attention to the problems facing poor people of all colors. At the beginning of the 1960s, the space program and the civil rights movement shared a sense of optimism. Scientific idealists believed that technical know-how would make the future better, and civil rights advocates fought hard to ensure that everyone, regardless of race or color or background, would receive the blessing of democracy that the United States Constitution promised all of the country's citizens. By the end of the decade, some of those civil rights leaders argued that the billions of dollars spent to send a handful of people to the moon could help many millions of people, or poor people here on Earth. Activists challenged NASA to consider the worthiness of the space program when disadvantaged people on Earth could barely put food on their table. Many people asked why there weren't any black astronauts and why there were only a few black engineers or scientists working for NASA. African Americans believed that outer space belonged to people of every race, and the space program should too. Not many of them knew that in Hampton, Virginia, black women like Catherine and Dorothy and Mary and Christine were working hard, using their mathematical talents to help the United States. Landing. On July 20th, 1969, more than 600 million people around the world sat in front of the TV, eager for the first close-up look at the heavenly body that they had only ever seen in sky from their earthly home. While the astronauts continued their 238,900-mile journey to the moon, Katherine Johnson had just finished a much shorter trip. She and about 100 of her sorority sisters had come to a quiet hotel in Pennsylvania mountains for a weekend retreat. Even there, however, everyone was eager for news of the historic voyage. The other women crowded around the hotel's small black and white television, listening to the news anchors and watching the screen as the astronauts glided closer and closer to their destination. The moon mission was so complex and it had taken more than 400,000 people working as a team to send the spacecraft safely on its way. Since the early 1960s, when President Kennedy announced that he wanted America to land a person on the moon, Katherine Johnson had worked hard on the analysis that had eventually made this day possible. She had given years of hard work to NASA and its mission, but the hardest part might have been to sit watching the astronauts moving away from Earth through the cold vacuum of space. Bound for the moon, she knew there was no way she would be able to relax until the astronauts had landed on the moon and returned safely back to Earth. Even with 26 manned flights under NASA's belt, this was different, and everyone knew it. Katherine Johnson watched the television. The Eagle, the lunar lander, a crab-like mechanical contraption carrying astronauts Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin, emerged from the Apollo command module and descended to the surface of the moon. At 10:38 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on July 20th, 1969, humankind set foot for the first time in history in a heavenly body other than Earth. Astronaut Neil Armstrong climbed down the ladder and stepped into the moon. That's one small step for a man and one giant leap for mankind. The actual landing had been one part of the mission that had been impossible to rehearse and the most dangerous. The Apollo 2 astronauts had given the mission only a so-so chance of success. Neil Armstrong thought they had a 50-50 chance of landing on the moon on the first try. Katherine Johnson had confidence. She knew her numbers were right. She always expected the best. You have to expect progress to be made, she said. Timing was everything. After the moonwalk, Katherine knew the astronauts had a brief window to get back into the lunar lander and reconnect with the mothership above. Then they had 3 long days on the highway back to Earth, followed by a journey through the fire of the atmosphere and down to the ocean below. She knew she would hold her breath until the space pioneers had been lifted from the ocean by the waiting Navy ships. But the mission was a success. From beginning to end, takeoff to splashdown, the astronauts have returned to their home on Earth safely. Catherine enjoyed a bit of ease, but only for a moment. NASA still had 6 more Apollo missions planned, and there was always the thrill of the next discovery. Now that NASA has successfully landed astronauts on the moon, Catherine and some of her coworkers had talked about a mission to Mars. Others dreamed about going even farther away from Earth, embarking on a grand tour that would send a spacecraft hopping from Mars to Jupiter to Saturn, like a stone skipped across a glassy lake. It wouldn't be easy, but the nimble minds at Langley could make it a reality. Catherine thought, why should flying a person to Mars be any less achievable than sending a man into orbit around Earth or landing a man on the moon? One thing built on the next. Catherine Johnson knew once you took the first step, anything was possible. Hi, we have finished our novel, Hidden Figures. And so, with that, I want you to always remember that with everything you do it with your greatest effort. Because when you do it with your greatest effort, not only do you learn more, but you also will accomplish more. So, until our next novel, I'll see you later. Hi. Bye.